Well, good afternoon. Welcome to today's Knowledge Miles lecture, the lecture series accompanying the 695th Lord Mayor of London. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Sir David Omond and Professor Brian Collins to talk about the preparation for a dangerous, uncertain future, combining policy, foresight, and experience. I'm really looking forward to today's session. David is a visiting professor in war studies at the King's College London. He's worked in UK security and intelligence as coordinator in the Cabinet Office, permanent secretary of the Home Office, director of GCHQ, and served on the Joint Intelligence Committee. He's published 4 books on intelligence, crisis management, and resilience, and we're very much looking forward to his contribution. Professor Brian Collins is vice chair of the National Preparedness Commission, whose mission is to help the UK be better prepared for an uncertain future. He took up the role of Professor of Engineering Policy at UCL in 2011, and then moved on to other things, but has also worked extensively in government as Chief Scientific Advisor to various departments. And we have 2 very, very experienced guests with us today. I'm Mike Wardle. I'm the Chief Executive at ZN. My job today is very much to moderate the session, which means doing a very brief introduction and getting out of the way so we can hear from our distinguished panelists. There will be an opportunity for Q&A, as you'll see from the program on the screen. The way to put in a question or an observation or a comment during the session is to find the question tab on the screen in front of you and type in your question. That will come to us and we'll be able to field those during the Q&A. And you can put in your question at any point during the session. Please keep the conversation running. We will pass over details of your email address to David and Brian if you do ask a question during the session. So if there's any need for any further follow-up discussion, that can be facilitated. We are recording the session today, so if you want to go back and re-listen, or you have friends and colleagues who you think might be intrigued by today's conversation, there'll be an opportunity for to share the recording with them. It'll be up on our website in the next 24 hours or so, and that'll be there for posterity as well. So really that's it by way of housekeeping. It's a really great pleasure to introduce Professor David Omond and Professor Brian Collins to have a discussion around resilience in the future. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mike, and I'm looking forward to this debate with Brian. When it comes to preparation for a dangerous future, the word resilience has a claim to be the word of the year. The government published last year a UK National Resilience Framework, and the document uses the word resilience no less than 556 times. The National Risk Register for the UK has 61 references to resilience. The Pentagon US Industrial Strategy has 21 references about highlighting the urgent need to restore supply chain resilience. The EU's Defence Industrial Strategy puts resilience right up there alongside defence readiness and security as EU strategic objectives. And even NATO is committed to the development of national resilience plans. So perhaps this is the moment to pause for a second and reflect on what actually does it mean to be resilient. Resilience is an engineering term. It's the ability of a material to absorb energy when it's subjected to an external force, but then able to release that energy safely after the impact. If you hit a copper pipe with a cricket bat, the pipe will buckle. The energy of the impact is not reflected, and it damages the internal structure of the pipe. A cricket ball, on the other hand, is resilient. Hit it with a cricket bat, and it uses the reflected energy to bounce off, hopefully, all the way to the boundary. It's easy to understand why crucial parts of national infrastructure, such as sea walls that are subject to crashing waves in winter, why they need to be resilient. But what about a supply chain? It's a complex, non-linear system of systems, or a cyber communications network. How do they behave when subject to disruption? How does the output from the complex system alter when one part fails, or when the information on which the system depends is corrupted or denied, like St. Thomas's Hospital. The blood test results they cannot access. In that case, it was the contractor doing the blood tests that got hacked with ransomware. But the consequence was operations right across the hospital, and 2 other major hospitals got postponed. So our digitized society is facing multiple threats and hazards that are unpredictable, they're new to us, and they make us, because of the interconnectedness of modern society, I think, increasingly vulnerable. Ideally, we should be demanding resilient designs so that the systems we all depend upon resume functioning after a short period of emergency readjustment after something happens. In practice, however, I can't see how you can quantify a right level of investment in resilience against the threats and hazards of the future. But where you find the need for obvious improvements, where there are gaps, then we should take action. So improving business continuity, improving cybersecurity, having spares, keeping stocks to smooth out disruption in supply, having the capacity to manufacture locally in some cases, and maintaining dormant capacity that can be brought into use if it's necessary. In my book, How to Survive a Crisis, the Penguin paperback edition came out last week, I distinguish between emergencies, crises, and disasters. Even in the best regulated organizations, emergencies arise. Business, for example, is used to disruptions, product recalls, depots catch fire, there are accidents, and so on. And we rely on well-trained emergency services being on hand. We can identify the likely types of emergency and prepare. Wise organizations have rehearsed their plans and have arrangements, for example, to draw on cybersecurity expertise. That's emergencies, but crises are different. They turn our world upside down. I use the rubber levers test. You reach out and pull the standard emergency response lever, but it bends in your hand. It doesn't seem to connect to the situation on the ground. Problems multiply, threatening a slide into disaster. And indeed, some of the steps we might try to take to control the situation seem to make matters worse. At least for a while, events seem out of our control. So being in crisis can be deeply scary, in my observation, especially for those used to being in charge, used to knowing what to do, and used to being able to dictate their priorities. But when crisis strikes, it manages you, not the other way around. How well those in charge respond matters enormously to how things turn out. Good leaders quickly mobilize their best talent. They bring extra resource to bear to discover innovative ways through the situation. COVID vaccines are a good example. And they delegate authority to those in a position to act and apply what has been called adaptive resilience to identify lessons as they go along during the crisis period so that the organization emerges from the experience stronger as well as wiser. But all too often, in my experience, when crisis strikes, you get denial. There's an unconscious impulse of avoidance. This can't really be happening to us. There's delay of decisions, especially the crucial decision to mobilize, in the vain hope of getting more clarity about the situation. You can see displacement activity, focusing the staff on everything but the real problem, and disruption as tempers fray and accusations fly around, too often accompanied by denigration of the bringers of bad news. As we saw with COVID-19, leaders may find it deeply unsettling when they find themselves in charge of a deteriorating situation to which, if they're honest, they personally do not know the solution. But by mobilizing the best talent, the team can find a way through. The hardest crises, in my experience, are the slowly burning ones, where the smouldering danger has not been spotted, or perhaps more often, it has been spotted, but the necessary tough decisions have been ducked. Perhaps the looming crisis doesn't fit the political narrative of those in charge, or it seems too expensive to fix, or leaders are fearful of subsequent media and market blame for exposing the problem. Of course, we all know in our hearts that it costs much more to fix problems after the crisis bursts than it would have done if managed earlier. And there are many examples of that, from the tragic events of the 7th of October to fire hazards and cladding on high-rise buildings before Grenfell, and racked concrete in schools before the roofs started to fall in. I think the lesson is sinking in. Expect more frequent and deeper crises over the coming decade, and expect to see those vulnerabilities that I spoke about, particularly in the digital world. I think it's probably best, therefore, to use the word resilience as a broad metaphor and include within the term the ability to anticipate, assess, prevent, and mitigate upstream, as well as the original engineering meaning of the ability to bounce back. There are horizon scanning methods that we can deploy to give what I call strategic notice of possible problems to come, and indeed possible opportunities we might seize if we prepare ourselves. But my final word on that would be having strategic notice of the possibility of something is not the same as predicting it will happen, and if so, when. There are no crystal balls. I'll stop at that.
David, thank you. I think the metaphors that you use to describe some of the factors that we live with are, in my experience, because I've been in command and control positions in a range of organizations, both public and private sector. So perhaps I'll give a couple of examples of that. There was a period during the 90s when viruses attacked computer systems, but they tended to walk around the computer systems relatively slowly because they were transmitted via plug-in devices like floppy disks, remember floppy disks, and USB sticks. But there was one that appeared in 2000 called the Love Bug, which was the first one that not only exploited the network, but it also exploited people's address books. And it propagated around the world extremely quickly. I was the CIO of a global organization at that time, and some of my staff had spotted that this actually was going to have a different dynamic. And so we were in a position, we were prepared to put in place the necessary controls that when it appeared, we knew what to do and we did it very quickly, with the exception of one country, because we were globally connected. And that one country said, no, we do our antivirus software update monthly, at the end of the month. Now, Lovebug propagated in minutes. And I had a stand-up conversation with the relevant people in that country, no names, no pack drill, and basically said, we want it done now, like this afternoon. No, we do it at the end of the month. So I said, look, unless you do it now, we're just going to disconnect you so that you don't become the propagator for Lovebug around the world. We do it at the end of the month. I then went basically to the CEO of that particular part of the organization and explained that they were going to be out of business within 2 days unless someone did the right thing, and they did it now. That changed the observation, and things happened very quickly. So this false sense of security that you might have if you think you know how to deal with something that changes to becoming a crisis from an emergency is, I think, very important. It's a mindset that you need to have in your leadership group that says, occasionally I'm going to have to move from what I think is the right way to doing things to new ways of doing things in the face of evidence that's in front of you. The same thing happened when a certain Icelandic volcano erupted, and I was the chief scientific advisor in the Department of Transport when that happened. And fortunately, we were able to mobilize, as David just said, a bunch of expertise around the country who knew pretty well everything that needed to be done in order to deal with gathering the facts about what the impact would be for that volcano and the ash that came from it on civil aviation in Europe, because unfortunately for the rest of Europe, we were responsible for deciding what to do with the whole of airspace in Europe. That's how it works around the planet. But as it happened, thanks to many billions of pounds every year over many decades in science and research, we had bodies of expertise in the universities and in industry in this country, which enabled us to mobilize the right people, the expertise and the capability to analyze the situation in a matter of days in order to decide what was a sensible opening of airspace and what the parameters had to be. In particular, we had one person who'd done a PhD on the volcanology of that particular volcano in Iceland. So they knew exactly what was coming out in terms of its geology and the dynamics of the ash cloud. Had we not invested in that person over a decade before, we wouldn't have been in such a good position. So there is something to do with being prepared by just having a very large knowledge base on subjects which are likely to become those which matter to you in the future. And it's not obvious now which ones those are going to be. So a broad base of knowledge generation is really good. The third thing I want to say about, from my experience, is having a no blame culture. There is no point having accusations flying around. David said, of course, that does happen, but there's no point in doing so because it's much more important to solve the problem, solve the issues, deal with it, than blame someone for not having anticipated it or for thinking, well, we'll wing our way through this and maybe it won't matter so much. The last thing I wanted to say by way of foresight, because I think we are in a position where foresight is really important, is that the past is now not particularly a good predictor of how things are in the future. A lot of the factors that are impacting us are very non-linear. So that means what the past has been is not a good predictor for the future. And a lot of the statistical analysis techniques which have been used in the past successfully, because things have changed more slowly, now become less practical, which means people have to get out of their comfort zone with regard to how to think about plausible futures for vulnerabilities, new vulnerabilities, or even old ones, which are now amplified by the circumstances we find ourselves in. And in particular, we're joining things up. The digital revolution that we're living through has caused lots of systems to be joined together in a way that they were never joined together before. And that means they behave together much more quickly with regard to things than they would have otherwise have done. There is almost no hiding place now across the planet as to the impact of a thing that happens in one part of the world impacting another. So for me, the preparation for dealing with crises and emergencies comes largely from making sure all the interested parties know what their role could be and should be in thinking about and anticipating what the future might hold, not only for them, but for those people who depend on them for whatever they do, supply chains being an obvious one for things like food and energy, but and of course that exposes vulnerabilities as well as opportunities. The last thing to say is all of this demands that people are much more curious and are much more imaginative about how plausible futures might impact them. That you should not be sitting back thinking tomorrow will be like today or yesterday. It almost certainly won't be. And as we are seeing and living through current events, whether it's climate change, geopolitics, or just the 8 billion people who live on the planet, all of those are having a significant impact on the way in which how we live in the future depends upon us being prepared for things being different from how they have been. So, David, I don't know whether that stimulates some thoughts and questions for us between us, but why don't I give you the opportunity to ask me one, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thanks, Brian. Lots of things there. Perhaps I could pick up, I mean, you picked up on something I mentioned about blame cultures. And it will be interesting just to think about how much can you learn from near misses?
Yeah.
It strikes me that if it's clear you're not going to blame people because they came perhaps a little too near danger, but actually it's for learning opportunity,
Yep.
and it could stop something much more serious happening the next time. Then we're much more likely to have the kind of honesty between the scientists, the engineers, the technical side, the financier, and so on. But once you get into finger pointing, then the chances are that if something is smoldering away and not working properly in part of the organization, the last person to hear about it will be the boss, because people will be terrified and they want to solve it themselves, and they don't realize that actually the only way you probably can solve a lot of these problems is mobilizing, looking out, getting all that talent and information in, and you probably need the clout of the boss to do that. So it strikes me there are a number of reasons why. I don't know how you do it
I
necessarily.
think that's right. I mean, one of the things having sat through SAGE groups and then talked about SAGE afterwards with Sir John Bennington, who was the GCSA, the government chief scientific advisor at the time, we after that said, why didn't we see this volcano as being a major threat to us? And we started to realize that it had so many peculiarly unique properties that it was very unlikely that we would have actually spotted that. But we then sat down and said, well, what other things could we imagine being like that? And who would convene, this is my point with regard to your comment there, who would convene the community of interests around that conversation in anticipation, so that everyone was better prepared, even just by imagining it. They would be better prepared than if they didn't imagine it. So I said earlier about imagination and curiosity being really rather important, and that short-term profitability, short-term efficiency isn't the only important game in delivering a good life for the population of the planet. Having time to reflect on what might happen is really rather important. And we don't give ourselves that time. We don't reward people for having that reflection process as part of what they do. So the convening power of the boss to have that conversation in anticipation of something going wrong, I think is really important. And convening power, I think, is something that we're beginning to see on the geopolitical scale, at a global scale, being very important. We're beginning to see that being a power base that nations haven't got, cities haven't got, but communities of interest around things like flooding, around food security, around disease spreading is beginning to capture the imagination of a range of communities around the planet.
Yeah, a good example of the convening power might be the Bletchley Park Summit on artificial intelligence.
Yes, exactly right.
Which did get some significant people together. It was more a question of identifying the issues and the problems and the research that might be needed than actually coming immediately to solutions, because a lot of this we don't yet know enough about. But
answering
AI,
asking the right questions early is actually a very important thing to be able to do. But you need the space and time and reflection opportunity to do that. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, you mentioned, Brian, the love bug virus, and what came into my mind was the NotPetya, the much more recent NotPetya attack, which was the Russians. It was attributed to a Russian group attacking Ukrainian companies by a supply chain attack on a small company that produced tax software, which was used by most companies in Ukraine. Ukrainian product, they used it. But what really caused the damage was that international global companies had offices in Ukraine, places like Odessa, and they got infected because they were also using the local software. And the cost of this, I think, has been estimated around about $10 billion just to fix global business after it got hit by this event. And that's something that could happen to any company or organization, or as we saw with the St. Thomas's, a hospital.
Yep.
from your standpoint, Brian, where does the organization start to ask the sort of questions which they need to ask in order to justify the kind of investment that probably most significant corporations ought to have for continuous 24/7 monitoring of networks and so on?
The difficulty you have is where is the boundary? Because most organizations don't have a clear boundary when they're networked to all their suppliers and their customers. So there isn't, in the way that there is a legal boundary around an organization and a human resource boundary around it. Their information and data boundaries are much less difficult, much less easy to prescribe exactly. And it is instantiated in workflow processes and in the software, which is very difficult to examine, and it's very difficult to ensure it is as it was when you launched it, because it can be, as you rightly said, interfered with by external agents who get inside the system and modify the software such that it does what they want, not what you want. There are a number of ways of dealing with that. One, of course, is to continuously monitor statistically to see whether anything that is happening on a second by second, if not a millisecond by millisecond basis, is out with what you might have expected to be happening. And if it is out with, then you have mechanisms by which you stop it very quickly. And that, I think, is one of the difficulties. Is very quickly is now much quicker than any human being would intervene. And there's been obviously examples of high-speed trading in the finance markets where people have exploited those sorts of vulnerabilities, and a lot has gone on between the regulators, between the software instantiators, and the implementers and operators to ensure those sorts of things don't happen, because they could bring down the whole of the financial market very fast indeed, which wouldn't be in anyone's interest. Which is, I think, the second point is some of these attacks haven't happened because when they do, they can be reflected back to the attacker, and it can be just as degrading to them as it is to those they're trying to attack. So I think there's something to do with understanding where I can have a bigger impact on what it is I'm attacking than could be impacted on me. And so that sort of causes people to think twice about attacking. But if they've got motives which are nothing to do with survival, or everything to do with destruction, then that's a much more difficult thing to deal with. What it comes down to is attention to detail, millisecond by millisecond, and training and expertise in not only in the software and operations of what you've got, but that which you have outsourced. And if what you touch on there is, in a number of cases, it's not the NHS that was hit, it was an IT operation that was under a contract by the NHS, or even 2 stages or 3 stages removed. Now, how do you ensure that that sort of rigor goes all the way out? How can you be prepared to be satisfied that you've done your job properly in providing that level of oversight? Really hard. And I don't know that we have that level of professional development in our organizations that handle that as well as we should.
I mean, your point about boundary, does this mean that the board of the PLC has to see itself as responsible not just for what is within the corporate boundary, but for the reliability of the subcontractors and supply chains? If you look at British Airways, Boots, major companies got hit, it was the outsourced personnel management who were themselves using a piece of software that they hadn't developed, but move it that they were using. And that's how the attackers got through. I mean, recently we had the armed forces themselves, their personnel records being hacked into. So that boundary then becomes, well, it's much larger.
It isn't a boundary in that. It isn't a boundary in that sense. It's a set of networks, and people like to think of the assets as being the company, but actually one of the assets is the linkages between the companies. And if you don't look after the integrity and confidentiality and and availability of those linkages, as well as the bodies which are connected by them, then you're in deep trouble. And that I don't think is something we do systemically enough. And that brings you back to the whole issue of systems thinking and systemic governance. We haven't got systemic governance in the way that you just described. The board doesn't have that systemic view of how does this company actually work? What are the systems on which it depends, which are out with the legal entity, which they are a board member for? And yeah, I think we need to think about corporate governance. Corporate governance doesn't align with the reality of large-scale networked organizations.
Brian, can I put another point to you? One of the questions I sometimes give my students at King's is, imagine a future in which China is the first country to develop a quantum computer that works at scale and that therefore can defeat the RSA cryptography, which defends almost all of our financial systems and quite a lot of our governmental and military ones as well. How do we begin to think about that possible future? Probably unlikely. The United States will probably get there first. But if it happened, it would provoke a crisis.
We have to think about whether use of conventional cryptography based on hard problems, which is where public key cryptography derives its strength, and think about, are there other mechanisms like quantum cryptography, which is a different way of sharing secrets, because that's basically what you're doing. And say, have I got a different way of doing it, which doesn't depend on that difficult problem, but on a much more fundamental difficult problem of the basis of how you share being something that, were it to be tampered with in any way whatsoever, you would not only know, you would not then enact that transition. And there is work out there, which has been going on for about 25 years, because I was involved in it when it started at the back end of the 2000s and before, which is aimed at doing exactly that, because everyone realized sooner or later public key cryptography was going to be breakable. So you have to find a different way of sharing secrets than using a hard problem, which a quantum computer can solve very quickly. So for me, we need to develop means of sharing secrets as fast as we need to, as fast as we can, in order to deal with that scenario that you've just described. And I think we're doing that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that we are. I mean, the key question then is, how long have we got? Because the transition for the financial sector, for example, to a completely different approach to cryptography would be that would be a real upheaval.
Yes, it would. It was a pretty big upheaval when we went to online trading, and I think we did it in probably a relatively short period of time, because it was seen as an absolute imperative that we needed to be able to do that. So I wouldn't underestimate the speed with which that community, the financial community in particular, could move in that direction. And actually, Mike probably is closer to that than I am at the moment in being able to say how long will it take before quantum based information sharing becomes the norm. I suspect it's within 5 years.
I was just about to say we did a piece of research to ask people, particularly in the finance community, how quickly they thought public cryptography would be broken by quantum, and they gave a 5-year timescale. So I think that's the timescale over which we need to be thinking. I've got quite a few questions from the audience. I wonder whether I could just interject a couple of them.
Yeah.
One from Dan Feeney saying that most banking organisations now be increasingly regulated by directives such as those from the National Institute of Standards and Technology or the Digital Operational Resilience Act. Is the problem actually we are just too interdependent on an all-pervasive internet rather than on some other system of more localized networks? Is that the fundamental problem which we need to be dealing with?
If I may, first of all, there's been a big push over the years to say we need separated internets to do various things within different communities, and everyone in the internet regulated community has said no. We actually have got to keep this whole thing wide open so that everyone can use it, and that conversation goes on as far as I'm aware. I certainly am on the side of trying to keep everything as open as possible, and using real-time mechanisms for looking for things which are challenging the integrity of the operations, in a way where you capture those things in real time, rather than using separation as the means by which you do it, because that's really what you're asking. So I wouldn't go that way, but that doesn't mean to say that you might want to do that temporarily. You might want to be able to switch that on and off. You may want to do it geographically, for the same reason. You may want to switch bits of the world on and off. So yeah, the architecture of how you separate is, I think, something we ought to be more active in considering.
Thank you very much, David. Terry Downing's commented that resilience leaders are now seen as kind of an umbrella function for being able to continue to operate in severe but plausible scenarios as a continuous sort of monitoring and response activity. But he wonders whether, without a civil defence command and control organisation, how do we ensure societal resilience in the same way as the companies are addressing their own resilience?
Well, in a sense, we've got the beginnings of that in the centre of government. The Cabinet Office has a highly developed sort of methodologies, a small staff who keep the machine in good repair. When something serious starts to loom, of course, you've then got to expand extremely rapidly, so that you have got the capacity to deal with a major crisis. And one of the tragedies of COVID-19 seems to have been the slowness with which we, in the first few weeks, we mobilized, and the tempers fraying and accusations flying around, as I put it, that were revealed to the COVID inquiry. If we don't have any longer in this country the Cold War mechanisms which we had, whether they would have worked in practice, of course, we can never know. But those were run down. The biggest weakness there is probably at the local government level because of the impact of austerity. Most local authorities now can only focus on the things which they have a statutory duty to do, such child welfare and so on, and they haven't got the capacity which they would need to have in order to provide a national response if you had a wide area set of problems. Ideally, we'd set about trying to fix this, perhaps over the next 10 years. That's how long it will probably take. But resources are going to be the big problem. There just isn't the public expenditure available to do that. But some form of at least connectivity between the local level is probably really is needed.
Thank you very much. Brian, I've got a couple of questions here. One on the question of from Tim Francis, what is the danger of groupthink and how do we avoid it? And then John Adams has asked, how do we deal with vested interests where the risks are known but ignored? Oil companies and the climate breakdown being one of the cases he cites.
So, yeah, groupthink is I think one of the dangers that comes from having groups of people who continuously meet as if they are the experts and the only people that matter. And the assumptions that are in there are that they are the only people that matter. So one of the things to do is to challenge that assumption and say, imagine what would happen if I asked someone outside this group what they might think about what it is we're discussing. And the leadership of a convening group is I think one of the things you need to do is the leader of that convening group needs to continuously challenge the groupthink by importing people into the group that are likely to challenge the groupthink purely by being there and just by asking what may look like simplistic questions in a way which is seen to be constructive, because otherwise they'll be shunned and disregarded. Difficult art form, but that's one of the things that in the past I felt I've done quite a lot of is to just be as it were, what used to be called a ginger group, which is to just stress test this thinking process that's going on and say, is it fit for purpose? And in particular, are the assumptions which you're making about how it used to be still valid? And I've just done a lot of work with the Royal Academy of Engineering on safer complex systems. And one of the findings that came out of those studies was in unvalidated assumptions about what is going on outside the group that did the safety case. And what's more, even if they were valid when they started, 6 months later, are they still valid? Do you reevaluate whether or not your assumptions are still valid? So that's the first thing to say. I think the second point with regard to challenging the vested interests that people might have is almost similar in the sense of it's an example of groupthink, because a vested interest is something which is sort of saying my interests are more important than anybody else's. So there's this balance between bringing expertise and humility to a party of convening conversations in order that everybody might benefit. And one of the words I've used quite recently is a gathering, rather than, which is a Scottish term for the clans, if you might remember. And it's all in order to make sure that once a year you have a meeting by which you then work out how you're not going to fight each other, because fighting each other is a very destructive and expensive process. So if you have a gathering of the clans who work out where all the friction points are likely to be, such that a vested interest, as an example, then that is much less likely to cause a real problem. But it goes back to something I said earlier, which is having the time and the motivation and the respect for having reflection time, discussion time, discourse time, in order to come to a common view about how things could be. And a gathering is perhaps an example of a metaphor for doing that. Orchestration is the other word we use quite often in the soft systems area, which is important for this.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but quickly, David, yes.
Yeah, just to say that it's not just groupthink. There's optimism bias, and there's what's called perseveration, sticking to old ideas long after their sell-by date is due. And on the Joint Intelligence Committee I sat for 7 years, a lot of time is spent trying to avoid these cognitive biases. But the key question, which I would recommend to anyone listening in on this, is just ask, when the judgment is finally reached, what would it take to cause us to change our mind on that?
Yeah.
And it's quite remarkable what a question like that can suddenly bring out that hasn't been part of the discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll
need to move quite quickly through the remaining question, I think. But first of all, Derek Marshall has asked whether you think, David, that government and industry have similar or differing approaches to resilience, and do they work in the same ways when they're thinking about resilience? And secondly, the question of whether short-term thinking is actually part of the problem, which needs both in government and business to be dealt with.
Yes, and yes would be my answer. Yes, particularly over the last few years, we've had national risk registers, been a lot of outreach by government talking to the various sectors of the critical national infrastructure. So I'm reasonably confident that we're thinking along similar lines. And I think probably yes would be my answer to the second one. We have become very short-sighted in this is part of modern politics. We need to get back to some much more serious, longer-term work backed up by research.
Thank you very much. Deborah Webster's returned to the question of blame culture, saying it seems to be quite prevalent in all sorts of ways in our political systems and societies. What are the ways in which we can work towards removing the culture, and would that automatically lead to an improvement in the quality of leadership in our political parties and government? Either of you, maybe David.
Yeah, but it has to start from the top down. So the boss has got to make it absolutely clear to those around that the first person to know of trouble is going to be the boss, who can then either do something about it or then delegate and say, no, I'll leave that one to you. But if you don't know about it, then there's nothing you can do until finally, as I said, the crisis bursts. So it's getting that sort of confidence that people have that they can tell the truth to each other. And that's another very useful idea to have around, is this an organization where people routinely tell the truth? Or are they always slightly spinning the story because they want to boost up this sector of the organization or that or whatever? There's a lot to be said for just honesty.
I think if I may, Mike, I think one of the difficulties, I don't disagree with what David's just said, but the value proposition that a CEO has is not only to do with keeping the business running in a high integrity way and delivering whatever it is supposed to be delivering, but it also, unfortunately, has a tension with regards to delivery of shareholder value and dividends and keeping their board happy. If they're the CEO, they've got to look upwards and downwards. And the value proposition upwards may not be the same as the value proposition downwards. And we've seen quite a lot of evidence just recently where people have been unfortunately caught in that trap and not necessarily done, unquote, the right thing. We've also seen people do the right thing. So I think, as Lord Peter Hennessy quite often says, you rely on people doing the right thing 100% of the time. And in our government and in our organizations, it's quite clear that has become stressed. Let me be polite about it. And I think that's really one of the tensions we're heading for, is the complications of interconnected organizations causes those sorts of stresses to become almost intolerable for the people in that leadership position, because they don't have very many places to go when things aren't quite how other people expect them to have been. And there's obviously very live cases in infrastructure, which is where I've been working most of my last 10, 15 years, where the stresses that are on CEOs are causing them to say, I'm not going to put up with this, I'm just going to leave it, I'm out, I'm not going to do that job, it's impossible. And I think we do have to worry. I said it earlier about corporate governance. I think we need to re-examine the corporate governance paradigms in this new space that we're operating in. Cadbury served us extremely well for the last 20 years. But I think it needs to be re-examined, because I think it's a very difficult ask for individuals to carry those sorts of multi-directional responsibilities and expectations with the integrity that's being asked of them.
We're a little bit over time, but we have sort of 3 or 4 questions still left, so I might ask your indulgence just to have some quick fire answers. Just on that last point, there's a private company in the States called Milliken, makes textiles, and their management structure is set up so that the only question they're allowed to answer at board level and all the levels of operational meeting is what's gone wrong recently and how did you fix it, which is, how do we learn from our mistakes rather than can we blame someone for what went wrong. A question from Katie Barnes just asking whether you would agree that the monitoring and analysing data is not sufficient, that we need sort of synthesis, scrutiny, sense making of data, and systems in particular that spot the gaps in the data that need to be filled by somebody. So, is monitoring and analysis not enough? Maybe
it's not enough. It's certainly not enough. Yeah, it's certainly not enough. But then choosing what it is to find you need to know more about and how often you need to know it, because as I said earlier, some of these things are changing so fast that what you might have thought was true in January is not true in June, and may not be true in July, let alone December. So I think the answer is yes, but it's sort of it's above the data management, information management. It's what is the leadership model for how what you know and what is known is used to good effect in development of policies and operations and education.
Thank you very much.
Data is dumb. You have to invest it with meaning.
Yes.
And that's a human activity. You have to explain, why are we seeing this data? What lies behind it? And that's the tricky bit.
Very much so.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question from Terry Downing, just whether it's any reflections on the current outsourcing business model. And contracts usually contain resilience of service, provisions at quite a nominal availability of service. Do we really need to be thinking about the outsourcing model as we go forward?
I could be really heretical here and say we always should have done. If you should only outsource that which you know perfectly how to do yourself, because otherwise all you're using is a mechanism other than the operational people you've got to run it through a contract, which probably you've got less expertise at doing. So, and that will apply not only to resilience, but it'll apply to almost everything else you outsource. So I will show my biases, and it is a bias, that outsourcing is a very dangerous game, and we've been doing it for 30 years because it looks as if it's a way of moving responsibility and authority, which it isn't. You certainly don't move accountability. As an advisor to government, I discovered big time when Secretaries of State tried to duck being accountable, and they were accountable. So I feel outsourcing is seen as a financial mechanism, not as a added value mechanism. And if you look at it as an added value mechanism, then you've got to think much harder and deeper than has been done in the past.
Thank you very much. Dr. Webster, sorry, David.
Yeah, very quickly, sort of with Brian on that, but there are certainly cases where the expertise that you need for the task simply isn't inside the organization, and you've got to draw. What we should be doing, of course, is looking at the outsourced function and being much tougher about the standards we would expect to be delivered under those circumstances. But sometimes it is inevitable.
Two final questions, if I may. First of all, Deborah Webster's asked, are we assuming or are we not assuming the US is always going to be the good actor? And then Dan Feeney's asked, is there one lesson from the COVID experience that you'd like to highlight as something which we need to take forward? Who'd like to go first? Brian, and you can leave the US question alone if you want to, or you can take it on.
Well, there's an assumption that they have always been the good actor, which is clearly not true. So, like all relationships at whatever scale, you have to manage the good and the less good. What I feel it is likely to be the case for most of the I mean, the US is let me go back one. The population of the US is probably less homogeneous at the scale of a very large country than almost anywhere else. And that lack of homogeneity means you need to ask the question, which part of the US are you talking about with regard to the alignment with what your values might be rather than anybody else's? And yes, that's going to change. Is the US unique in that regard? No. There are going to be lots of other countries, other nation states, which are going to have that change as migration occurs and immigration changes. So the concept of the nation state is a relatively new concept in humankind. So I think you need to examine that, have a look at the city state, which is growing in importance around the planet. So I'd stop there and just say, it's an interesting question, but it's not a sufficiently deep and broad question to ask in the context of this, what we're talking about.
Thank you. And
I'll leave
David,
the second one to David.
To which I think I would add, don't write off the United States too quickly.
Oh.
There are enormous strengths in the US, and I personally don't expect the United States to abandon Europe when it comes to global security, because that would not be in the interests of the United States itself. On your COVID question, the key word for me is mobilization. When something big happens, you've got to mobilize and bring in resource, look for resource from outside the organization. Just hoping you can muddle through ain't going to crack it. And it's a big decision for anyone at the top of a government or top of an organization to do, to say, no, this really looks serious. We're going to pile everything into this. And it means all the second order, third order things get pushed right down the scale. The whole organization or the whole government is now focused on this one task. And we got there on COVID, but we didn't mobilize fast enough.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid time has beaten us. I'm sure we could have carried on with the discussion for longer. We might have to invite you both back for a further discussion on a future date. For those of you who've attended, thank you so much for your attendance today and your participation. We've got some interesting material coming up on Wednesday. Clear skies ahead, funding space debris cleanup. On the 13th, embracing multilingualism. On Wednesday next week, seeing as believing, the miracle of modern eye health care. So, as always, fascinating lectures coming up in the Knowledge Miles series. Just remains for me to thank Professor David Omond and Professor Brian Collins. Thank you so much for your time and your contribution today, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you all.
Pleasure. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.